For over 200 years, trains have changed our lives. They've reshaped our towns and cities with groundbreaking engineering.
The idea of the underground, this was a completely revolutionary, visionary idea.
Inventions like the rocket powered Britain's industrial revolution and went on to build an empire.
Rocket is the locomotive that absolutely changed the world.
They heralded in an age of leisure and luxury travel that we still enjoy today.
The train allowed people to escape their everyday life.
And speedmasters like the legendary Flying Scotsman even helped to change our diets.
Fish can be caught off the Cornwall coast and brought into London within a day.
This time, the story of how Britain became a nation of speed freaks obsessed with moving people and goods faster and faster.
The railways invented speed.
The battle for passengers was fierce in the age of steam.
This icon of steam, rail and glamour whizzing past your face.
Later, a global race drove us into the high-speed era with the bullet train and the TGV.
A true, absolute engineering miracle.
And into the future, how fast will the train take us? '20s Britain, a nation still recovering from the Great War. Although the country was in the process of rebuilding, a different kind of war was taking place on its railways.
Already the passengers are arriving at the station, and here life is just one arrival after departure.
At the start of 1923, 4 railway companies dominated Britain's network of tracks. Some of the most popular routes had to be shared between them, and competition for customers became fierce. One such destination was the prestigious London to Edinburgh route, shared between the London and North Eastern Railway, or LNER, and the London, Midland and Scottish Railway.
So because of the grouping of the railways, if you wanted to go up to Edinburgh, you had a choice. You could either go to London King's Cross and get on the London North Eastern Railway, or you could go and get on the London Midland Scottish route.
Each company was seeking a secret weapon to wrestle passengers from their rivals. And the London and North Eastern Railway was on the verge of a major breakthrough.
There was always a great rivalry between the East and West Coast routes as who could get to Scotland the fastest.
The weapon of choice in this public relations battle was speed. And the LNER's answer for that was Flying Scotsman, the most famous locomotive of all time. Running non-stop along the 390-mile-long route, it cut the journey time between London and Edinburgh to just over 8 hours.
Well, the non-stop service in 1928, when they launched that was very much a coup, because this was the longest journey you could go non-stop in the world.
The Flying Scotsman name was nothing new. It had been associated with the London to Edinburgh service since the 19th century. But in 1923, a brand new locomotive bearing the Flying Scotsman name was introduced. It was designed by one of the great engineers of the early 20th century, Nigel Brzi.
The Flying Scotsman was a development of lots of things that were before it.
When it came out, it was regarded as colossal. It was the biggest engine, express engine, on the network at that time.
It had huge driving wheels, and also it had improved valve gear, which are the things that enable the steam to get into the cylinders and go on the pistons and so on.
Almost 90 years after it first built ahead of steam, this famous locomotive is still running, and is now making sightseeing trips between London and York. Andrew Martin has written several books about the history of trains, and his favourite is Flying Scotsman.
I mean, you know it's going fast because in the dining car your knife might be tinkling against the glass. Your gin and tonic would be wobbling a bit. Well, it was supposed to be glamorous. There was a barber for men, who shaved you with a cutthroat razor, going at 90 miles an hour. There was a salon de coiffure for women. Of course, there was a bar and there was a restaurant. The first class especially was very well appointed.
For the London and North Eastern Railway Company, who ran Flying Scotsman, luxury was not its only selling point. It was designed to win the publicity war by being faster than the competition. To achieve that goal, the train's designer Nigel Brzi was asked to oversee an attempt on reaching the magical speed of 100 miles per hour. The record attempt would take place on the 30th of November, 1934, between Leeds and King's Cross.
Well, the 100-mile-an-hour run was a publicity stunt, like all these record attempts. But this was all about an excuse for a headline. A speed record gives you a pretext for a headline. And it was all about getting the train into the newspapers.
Trusted with pushing this steam engine harder and faster than it had ever been before was William Sparshott.
Apparently when William Sparshott set off, he said to some onlookers, because in those days lots of train spotters around, he said, well, if we hit something today, we'll hit it hard. Because he was known as a hard-driving driver.
To calculate the speed the train would reach, a special measurement carriage, known as a dynamometer, was attached. And it still exists today. The dynamometer car has been extensively restored by the National Railway Museum in York.
We're in the dynamometer car, which came into service with the North Eastern Railway in 1906. It's a mobile laboratory specifically designed to measure the power of steam locomotives. There will be one gentleman here in this seat. He would be in charge. There'll be one on each side of him holding those pull buttons there, because when they're reading all this apparatus, it means nothing unless they know where they are. So speed was a crucial factor of the whole picture. And every quarter of a mile, when they see the mileposts, those fellas would push that button and it would record on here. This is a dynamometer car roll, typical of something that would have passed through this machine. The boffins could look at this, they could work out the speed and all the other things they needed to know as well.
On the day of the record attempt, the engine maintained a high average speed on the outbound journey from King's Cross, but was nowhere near the 100 miles per hour mark. It looked like Flying Scotsman wouldn't be making headlines after all. But on a return leg from Leeds, driver Bill Sparshott knew he still had one chance of hitting 100 miles per hour. On a downhill section of track, 90 miles from London, he stokes the engine and gives it all he's got. And victory.
Coming down from Grantham, Stoke Bank, approaching Peterborough, they touched that magic 100 miles an hour. But of course, the press are already primed. They've got photographs. They make sure that it goes on the news that day when it comes in, and it's in the newspapers the following day.
And absolutely amazing, from the fact that in 130 years, the train has gone from a rattling along 5 miles an hour to a shooting 100 miles an hour. Britain really feels it's leading the world in trains.
Flying Scotsman had captured the public's imagination. The train even starred in a movie bearing the same title, complete with thrilling sequences of the heroine desperately clutching to the outside of the carriages as it speeds through the countryside. In breaking the 100 mile per hour barrier, Flying Scotsman kicked off a new era of speed on the railways. But how did the steam age begin? Britain, before the advent of the railways, was not a speedy place. It was still a land of leisurely walks and cricket on the village green.
Before the advent of the railways, nobody really travelled faster than a horse could gallop. There was a network of stagecoaches which were pretty slow, would take, maybe 10 miles an hour, 15 miles an hour average at the best. And so there's no way of getting around, and nobody had travelled very fast at all.
But the Industrial Revolution would change everything. Factories sprang up, producing huge amounts of consumer goods. And captains of industry demanded their products were transported more quickly than the competition. Merthyr Tydfil, South Wales, was a centre of the Industrial Revolution and home to 4 of the greatest ironworks in the world. It's also the place where rail travel was born. In 1804, a machine designed by engineer Richard Trevithick was tasked with hauling 10 tons of iron from these works. By mounting a high-pressure steam engine on wheels, he invented the world's first locomotive, though speed wasn't its forte.
The early locomotives were really primitive affairs and could get up to maybe 4 or 5 miles an hour. They weren't really seen as an invention that would, within the space of 20, 30 years, be taking people across Britain at 40 or 50 miles an hour.
Soon railways were springing up around the country. In October 1829, in the village of Rainhill in Lancashire, trials were held to find the fastest locomotive for a new line between Liverpool and Manchester. These revolutionary trials tested the 5 competing engines to their limits.
The Rainhill trials was a fantastic media event. Thousands of people turned up to watch these engines racing each other.
One of the entrants was Robert Stephenson.
He was desperate to prove that steam power was the way forward, so he put into this trial his idea of what could be the perfect locomotive to haul trains.
Over a century before Flying Scotsman did the ton, Stephenson's locomotive, the aptly named Rocket, was capable of speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, 3 times faster than a horse and cart. On the day of the trials, around 15,000 people turned up to watch it trounce the other 4 entrants in the competition.
Stephenson's Rocket was a revelation. And it's unimaginable. People who'd only ever gone as fast as a galloping horse could take them now watched this little yellow locomotive whizzing up and down the track. Absolutely astonishing.
The Rocket became so famous, a replica was featured in this 1923 Buster Keaton film. While it was slow by today's standards, Stephenson's Rocket kicked off a period known as the Railway Mania.
Through the railway mania of the 1840s, people begin to realise that trains mean speed. You can whiz across the country, and most importantly, you can get goods from A to B incredibly quickly. Your mail could go by train so quickly, and the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was the first railway to carry mail. So you have this really zippy exchange of news, and that's really important for business, because business can now communicate between different factories.
The increased competition between companies during the Railway Mania continued to drive up speeds, which had a knock-on effect on what people could eat and drink.
Speed is so important to the Victorian diet because really they were very limited to what they could get around them in terms of perishable goods, in terms of dairy, meat, milk, eggs.
Strawberries, fruit sent in from quite distant farms into the centre of the major cities.
Fish could be caught off the Cornwall coast and brought into London within a day.
Every aspect of people's diet was improved.
As railways stretched further into the countryside during the Victorian era, they touched the lives of more and more people.
You must remember that people had never seen stuff going this fast, and someone called them fire-breathing devils as they passed along the farmland, hurling out smoke and sparks and steam. This must be terrifying to you.
There were fears that travelling at speed might mean that maybe all the animals in the field would die of shock. The sheep would all end up black from the smoke.
But these fears weren't limited to the fields and cobbles of Victorian Britain. Even the Queen herself felt the same way.
Queen Victoria was a bit apprehensive about the railways. She didn't like the idea of going fast.
She said 30 miles an hour was all she would go at, because otherwise it was bad for her health.
So when the Royal Train went through, it did cause congestion because the other trains would be held up behind her.
But the Victorians weren't just worried that speed may damage their bodies. They were also concerned about losing their minds.
The fact that it's going so fast, so quickly, will drive man into this animalistic wildness. And there's a great picture on the front of the police news of a man jumping into a railway carriage, a maniac striking his friend. The idea is that suddenly, if you get on a train, it can send you so wild, you could want to kill one of your friends.
Fortunately, these sensationalist stories about the railways did not put people off. And as trains became faster, travel between Britain's major cities became more widely accessible. Flying Scotsman, which plied the route between London and Edinburgh, came to represent the golden age of steam travel. In Kettering, the recently restored Flying Scotsman has arrived after the 2.5-hour trip from London. The crowds are out to witness this unique piece of railway history.
It's just a very major celebrity, isn't it? Surrounded by hundreds of people. In fact, it's quite touchy to think apparently all the local radio stations along the way, wherever it goes, they tell people it's coming. It's like this message relayed across the whole country.
It's fast, but when you're at 75 miles an hour, it feels like it's floating. The higher speed you go, the more it settles down. It just means that you get a lot dustier because there's like a little vortex in the tender with all the coal dust, as you can probably see.
Flying Scotsman's achievement in breaking the 100-mile-per-hour barrier meant its place in history was secure. But 100 miles per hour wasn't fast enough for its designer, Nigel Gresley. Flying Scotsman was soon overhauled by what would become the fastest steam-powered locomotive in history, an engine known as Mallard. Its sleek curves ushered in a new era of high-speed train design.
Mallard's bodywork was done at a time when streamlining was everything, and actually it was modelled similarly on a Bugatti car. It was designed to cut through the air. It was a very fast train indeed.
They were designed for pure speed, so these were the racehorses of the railway world. And it was taken out on this test run. The directors of the London North Eastern Railway and the engineers, Gresley chief among them, wanted to see how fast they could go.
In 1938, just 4 years after Flying Scotsman reached the 100-mile-per-hour mark, the Mallard smashed the record as the speedometer hit 126 miles per hour. A record it retains to this day as the fastest steam engine of all time.
In 1934, we had the Flying Scotsman, 100 miles an hour. In 1938, we get the Mallard, 126 miles an hour. Absolutely amazing. They can't be bettered.
So this was maybe the high point of steam engine technology, celebrated at the time as a great achievement, but probably the end of an era of a particular technology.
To all with a soft spot in their heart for steam locomotives, it's a sad farewell to one of the finest ever built, Mallard.
The steam locomotive, by now well over 100 years old, was beginning to show its age. They were fantastically complicated machines with many moving parts, which needed constant maintenance. and steam trains had to carry huge amounts of heavy fuel. Coal. Inefficient steam engines like Flying Scotsman and Mallard were about to be left behind by diesel power.
Now, meanwhile, there was a new lobby at work, which was the oil lobby. Oil offered this new promise of the internal combustion engine, the diesel engine, and a new form of train that would not only be fast, but it was a machine that you could switch on at the turn of a key.
And there was one country that was racing ahead with this new technology.
In America, in the 1930s, the rail companies decided to develop a completely new generation of trains. These were diesel trains, which looked very modern, a sort of mix of Art Deco and modernist, travelled much faster than anything before.
1934 saw the introduction of the diesel-powered Zephyr.
This train, built of stainless steel, just weighs nothing. 10 men can easily hold it along the track.
On the 26th of May, it made a record-breaking dawn-to-dusk run between Denver and Chicago, covering the 1,000-mile journey in just over 13 hours.
America's famous streamlined train gets up speed on its new record-smashing transcontinental run and attaining a maximum speed of 120 miles an hour.
The Zephyr was the first of the diesel-powered streamliners, considered by some the most beautiful and glamorous trains ever built.
These diesel rail cars in the 1930s were definitely the way forward, and their streamlining was there to show that diesel was the future and steam was the past.
Diesel had made trains faster, more efficient, and more reliable. Higher speed passenger services started to appear all over the world. But by the 1950s, a new rival to the train emerged.
The Renault Dauphine. First, see the Dauphine's maneuverability in traffic. Look how it gets around.
After the Second World War, most countries across the world expanded their road networks. Cars became much cheaper.
The car was so speedy and so independent you can go anywhere.
But cars weren't the only threat.
And aloft, cruising in comfort at 10 or 20,000 feet.
The aircraft had arrived. Planes were now flying quickly, frequently, and safely.
And there was a general feeling that really the age of the train was now past.
When you listen to a lot of politicians talking in the 1950s and 60s, the train was some old-fashioned Victorian thing that we had to get rid of. That was the argument being pushed, and a lot of people believed it. So the railways were in a way they were under real threat, and what they needed to do was to push back hard.
By the 1950s, it looked like the train had had its day as the go-to mode of transport. The railway industry only knew how to respond in one way.
Were a huge leap forward.
They were going to get faster and faster. Within the space of a century, trains had transformed how fast we could move. From the speed of a galloping horse to the 100-mile-per-hour Flying Scotsman. But by the end of the 1950s, planes and cars had eclipsed trains. Government policy was overwhelmingly anti-train and pro-motorway. Trains were simply no longer the way people wanted to get around in a hurry. But then, seemingly out of the blue, a bullet shot across the horizon. In 1964, as it hosted the Olympics, Japan left the rest of the world in its wake as it unveiled the world's first ever electric high-speed line and the instantly iconic Shinkansen bullet train.
Shinkansen bullet trains were a huge leap forward. They were a quantum leap.
Post-war Japan was in a terrible state. The railways were seen as a mechanism by which they could emerge from post-war state of dereliction.
The Shinkansen heralded Japan's stratospheric rise as an economic superpower. And everything about the train's design announced its modernity.
They look more and more like alien sharks or strange creatures from lost underwater planets. When the train comes into a station, you think, whoa, I've never seen anything like it.
Inside the first bullet trains, the design was also revolutionary.
So we're sat in a Shinkansen Series 0. It's like being sat in a 1960s aeroplane, and that's quite deliberate. It's designed to be like an aeroplane, designed to empty the airlines, designed to make you comfortable at high speed.
In stark contrast to the rest of the world, the Japanese invested heavily in trains.
In the 1960s, if you're in Britain, rock and roll cars and planes. You know, people wanted their Ford Zephyr or whatever to roar up the M1, which was brand new, nobody on it. Well, the Japanese didn't go down that road. They said, no, we're going to go with a fast train from point to point.
Not only were they fast, they were famously comfortable.
And if you were sat down in one of these seats, and the train was roaring along at 130 miles an hour, you wouldn't feel it. You'd think, I'm in the modern world.
The Shinkansen trains are probably the smoothest trains I've ever travelled on. The train just eases away from the platform.
Travelling on a Shinkansen train at speed is as if you were riding along a silk kimono.
If I was a Japanese bullet train driver, I'd be right at the top of my profession. And I'd be very important, or almost sort of star status. He'd put on his white gloves, and then he would be able to drive the train.
The bullet train ran on dedicated high-speed tracks that enabled it to zip along at 130 miles per hour and slash the journey from Tokyo to Osaka from 7 hours to just 4.
Well, what makes the Shinkansen so fast, of course, it's got a dedicated track, which is fairly straight. But instead of there being one engine and a pile of coaches with only the engine having the power and the coaches being dragged along, every single wheel on this train is powered. In iconic terms, this train ran past Mount Fuji. It meant you had a picture of modernity. It meant Japan had stepped away from the horrors of the Second World War, was proving that it was forward. It was forward in a new way.
The Shinkansen bullet train wasn't just a revolution in engineering. It had a revolutionary effect on Japan's economy and culture. It was also the inspiration for a new high-speed age around the globe.
After the unveiling of the bullet train, we really start to see a train race, a train arms race, you might say, throughout the world.
Over in Britain, there'd been little investment for decades.
Britain's railway was in slow decline really in the 1960s and 1970s.
British Rail was more famous for its delayed trains and soggy sandwiches than for its technical innovation.
But there was one vehicle, one train, that actually changed the face of British Rail.
A decade after the bullet train was launched, Britain was back in the speed game with the Intercity 125. Named after its top operating speed of 125 miles per hour, it remains the fastest ever diesel-powered train. And its design was groundbreaking. The nose was streamlined like a racing car. The train was fashioned from robust molded plastic. And the power was souped up with a diesel-electric power car at each end of the train.
It was the bringing together of so much tech into one place that made this a revolutionary train. And frankly, it conquered the whole of British Rail, and it saved British Rail. It really was, it was known as the journey shrinker.
But in spite of its success, the Intercity 125 was facing heavy competition from coaches and cars. A canny marketing campaign tried to persuade car-mad Brits to embrace what the new train had to offer.
Here's a lovely comparison of road and rail. It was so successful actually other countries licensed the concept out for their own railways. So Germany did a similar advert, almost exactly the same as some of their electric trains later on that year.
Even though it could carry passengers between cities quicker than ever before, one thing held the Intercity 125 back from achieving its full potential. It was running on the same tracks that would have carried Flying Scotsman 50 years earlier.
In the late 70s, you've got Britain's high-speed train 125 herring around on Victorian technology, really, on these ancient railway curvy routes all over the place. But in France, they go one step further. They make this better. They build dedicated, brand new high-speed tracks, which means the trains go much, much faster without the impediment of going around corners or slow trains getting in their way. And so the top engineers in the country come together to build TGV, a train grande vitesse.
The Intercity 125's time as the most advanced train in Europe was done. This was a new dawn for high-speed rail on the continent, and the TGV was at the forefront. In a dazzling test run in 1981, France's first high-speed train clocked up a breathtaking speed of 236 miles per hour.
The train is zipping along so fast, it just... And it's truly a magnificent moment.
It smashed the previous record by an incredible 30 miles per hour.
And in 1981, France seizes the high-speed crown.
And you would do after all the investment from the government to get into this massive high-speed train project.
Later that year, the line from Paris to Lyon opened to the public. Its operational speed was slower than the test run, but at 161 miles per hour, it was still the fastest train in the world. The arrival of the TGV marked the debut of the French government's massive expansion of high-speed rail. It was a symbol of national pride and the envy of Europe. Back in Britain, our trains were still crawling along on a decades-old track. But what came next would change the UK's railways forever. The world's longest international rail tunnel.
On the other side of the wall, chalk only a few inches thick, his British counterpart, Graham Fagg, was drilling too.
The 1st of December, 1990. Somewhere under the English Channel, 2 construction workers drilled through the final section of rock to join the 2 halves of the Channel Tunnel.
They're through, they're through. They're through. There's the handshake we've all been waiting for.
It's a momentous day, and the first time that Britain and mainland Europe are connected since the last ice age.
The 2 tunnellers exchanged national flags. As the champagne flowed in probably the biggest ever underground party, the entente was very cordial. Arriving for the 9:53 to France, this was the Queen's first glimpse of Waterloo's glittering international rail terminal. From here, the Eurostar Express will begin its 3-hour journey to Paris.
But when the tunnel finally opens for business in 1994, the trains only run at high speed on the French side. For the opening ceremony, the Queen travels from Waterloo to Calais at a sedate 80 miles per hour. Whereas in France, President Mitterrand's party raced to Calais at over double the speed, a slick 186 miles per hour.
The formal opening ceremony at Coquelles preceded another first.
The problem was simple.
Trains ran high speed from Paris across the country into the tunnel at great speed, and then emerged and then slowed to a crawl as they came out, off dedicated railway lines onto Britain's Victorian railway network.
In fact, it wasn't until the 21st century that Britain caught up with its old rival. Finally, in 2007, Britain opened its first ever dedicated high-speed line. Running from London to the Channel Tunnel at a top speed of 186 miles per hour, it cut the journey time to Paris from almost 3 hours to just 2 hours and 15 minutes. All across Europe, high-speed networks are expanding rapidly. While Britain's HS2 stalls amid massive controversy, the rest of Europe has surged ahead.
High speed had developed so much across Europe for a key reason. There are so many countries or big cities quite close together, which it doesn't really make sense to fly across. Under 2.5 hours, rail becomes a real competitor. Now, why wouldn't you want to travel from city centre to city centre and avoid all those horrible queues and all that awful stuff, and get a great view, and get up and walk around a bit? I mean, that is how you want to fly around Europe. You fly around Europe by train.
And it's not just Europe. From South Korea to Saudi Arabia, there are now high-speed networks in over 20 countries. Japan, the country that pioneered high-speed travel, has a vast network of famously punctual bullet trains. The view is unchanged, but the trains have sped up since their debut in 1964, with the fastest Shinkansen running at an incredible 199 miles per hour. But the Shinkansen is no longer the fastest passenger train in the world. That title has been taken by China.
The Chinese have developed an amazing network of high-speed trains, really linking all their major cities with high-speed lines, because they realise that is a much more efficient form of transport than aviation.
Japan versus China in terms of railway speed, of course, it's a cultural rivalry, an economic rivalry, a political rivalry. They watch each other across the sea and they want to beat each other.
They are just smashing through new high-speed lines. They haven't got to deal with Victorian tech. They're going straight to electric power and proving themselves on the world stage.
And it's not just the longest network in the world, it's also the fastest, reaching speeds up to a breathtaking 217 miles per hour between Beijing and Shanghai.
Trains will carry on getting faster, as long as the technology and physical manifestations that enable it in a safe way to do it. We are talking about things that run on 2 strips of steel, on little wheels.
And the Chinese have built something that doesn't rely on wheels. The maglev. It glides across the track using magnetic levitation. This lack of friction means they can go faster than any other train in the world.
Less than 100 years after the Flying Scotsman, you have the maglev train. That is incredible, a true, absolute engineering miracle.
This train does actually feel very different from a Japanese bullet train. It's a hell of a lot faster. But the minute it starts to move, the train starts to tip forward, you find yourself leaning back, and within seconds, you're literally being thrown round corners, and you can feel the skin on your face being pulled back.
Although the track is only 19 miles long from the airport to the city, the maglev covers this ground in just over 7 minutes, reaching a top speed of 268 miles per hour. That's the absolute fastest any paying passenger can go on any train in the world. So is this a vision of the future?
Trains and speed are inextricably interlinked, and the train is getting faster and faster every decade. I wonder whether those Victorians who were so delighted by going at 60 miles an hour could imagine there'll be Japanese and Chinese trains now going at over 500 kilometres an hour.
What is amazing today is that this 19th century invention is now a very clean form of transport with electric trains. It's seen as environmentally much more sustainable.
It'll be lovely to watch a Victorian technology come into the 21st century and continue to deliver on the promises it made all that time ago.
In a way, it's the car nowadays that is seen as an old-fashioned invention. The railways are seen as modern, and maybe one day they might even outlive the car.
Almost a century after Flying Scotsman flew into the history books, breaking the 100-mile-an-hour barrier, trains now go at once unimaginable speeds. Trains have been faced with setbacks and challenges, but have overcome them every time. They are now carrying billions of people around the globe faster than ever before. The solution to our transport problems has been with us all along. When it comes to speed, the train is our past, present, and future.
This probably is the new age of the train.